The 9,858th meeting of the Security Council is called to order. The provisional agenda for this meeting is this situation in the Middle East. The agenda is adopted. In accordance with Rules 37 of the Council's Provisional Rules of Procedure, I invite the representative of Yemen to participate in this meeting. It is so decided. In accordance with Rules 39 of the Council's Provisional Rules of Procedure, I invite the following briefers to participate in this meeting. Mr. Hans Grundberg, Special Envoy of the Secretary-General for Yemen, and Mr. Tom Fletcher, Under-Secretary General for Humanitarian Affairs and Emergency Relief Coordinator. It is so decided. The Security Council will now begin consideration of Agenda Item 2. I now give the floor to Mr. Hans Grundberg.
Thank you, Mr. President. Mr. President, since I last addressed this Council, we have witnessed a significant, albeit fragile, development in the Middle East with the ceasefire in Gaza. We have also seen a cessation of attacks by Ansar Allah on vessels in the Red Sea and targets in Israel. This tentative reduction in hostilities, along with the release of the crew of the motor vessel Galaxy Leader, is a welcome relief. We must build on this opportunity as a foundation for further de-escalation. Yet, while we welcome this reprieve, we must also acknowledge the magnitude of the challenges still facing Yemen. Mr. President, a deeply troubling development is the fourth wave of arbitrary detentions of United Nations staff conducted by Ansar Allah last month. These detentions are not only a violation of fundamental human rights, but also a direct threat to the United Nations' ability to provide humanitarian assistance to millions in need. Even more deplorable is the death, while detained by Ansar Allah, of a UN colleague working for the World Food Programme. And I join the Secretary-General in calling for an immediate, transparent and thorough investigation of his death, and for those responsible to be held accountable. I also echo the Secretary-General's strong condemnation of these detentions and call for their immediate and unconditional release, along with the rest of the United Nations, NGO, civil society and diplomatic mission staff arbitrarily detained. I appreciate the support of this Council to the United Nations during this difficult time. Allow me also to express my deepest condolences to Ahmed's family and to the World Food Programme. Regrettably, we have also seen a continuation of military activity in Yemen, with reports of the movement of reinforcement and equipment towards the front lines, and shelling, drone attacks and infiltration attempts by Ansar Allah on multiple front lines, including in Abyan, Al-Dali, Laj, Ma'arib, Sada, Shabwa and Taiz. I call on the parties to refrain from military posturing and retaliatory measures that could lead to further tension and risk plunging Yemen back into conflict. My office remains in regular contact with the parties, urging them to de-escalate tensions and take concrete confidence-building measures through the Military Coordination Committee. Mr. President, I am deeply concerned about Yemen's rapidly deteriorating economic situation. These hardships are felt across all of Yemen. In government-controlled areas, residents have endured prolonged blackouts, sometimes for over 24 hours. Last week, Aden went 3 consecutive days without electricity, which led people taking to the streets. That this is happening in winter, when energy demand is lower, speaks to the severity of the crisis. Moreover, the continued depreciation of the Yemeni rial has sent the cost of essential goods soaring, making simply surviving a challenge for millions. For many families, even the most basic necessities, food, medicine and fuel, have become unaffordable. This economic hardship is not limited to government-controlled areas. In Ansar Allah-controlled territories, ordinary Yemenis also struggle to afford basic commodities. These hardships are symptoms of the failure to achieve a sustainable political resolution. Without the prospect of peace, there cannot be prosperity. My office continues its engagement with the parties to the conflict to advance sustainable, achievable, and practical solutions that will benefit the Yemeni population. As part of our continued political dialogues, my office has also recently engaged with civil society representatives, including youth and women from Aden, Abyan, Al-Dale, Lahej, and Shabwa, to incorporate local-level perspectives into the peace process. We also heard firsthand from Yemeni businesswomen across the country. Despite their potential to unlock economic growth and opportunities in Yemen, they are faced with growing impediments preventing them from fully participating in the economy, including regulatory constraints and limited access to banking. Women also continue to face similar challenges in engaging meaningfully in the peace process. Mr. President, while clarifications are sought regarding the upcoming US designation of Ansar Allah as a foreign terrorist organization, it is important that our efforts to advance the peace process are protected. I am committed to carrying out my duties in accordance with the mandate from this Council to end the conflict in Yemen. Over the past month, I have continued my active engagement with all regional and international actors, most recently in Washington. My message to all remains that only a political settlement of the conflict will support the Yemenis in their aspiration for lasting peace. It is achievable, it is possible, and it is pragmatic. The elements of the roadmap already provide a framework for this path forward. The parties committed to a nationwide ceasefire as the first step towards stability, recognizing that only an end to hostilities can create the conditions necessary for meaningful dialogue. This would pave the way for a structured political process in which Yemenis can determine their own future through inclusive negotiations under UN auspices. It is critically important that my office maintains appropriate space for engaging in effective mediation. Moreover, addressing Yemen's economic crisis through sustained dialogue and concrete measures will be vital for rebuilding the country and preventing further hardship for its people. In this regard, I urge the parties to seize the opportunity created by the recent regional de-escalation and to build confidence through meaningful actions. The unilateral release of 153 conflict-related detainees by Ansar Allah is a positive step, and I encourage further progress. It is high time the parties make the necessary compromises to reach an agreement for the release of all those still held in relation to the conflict. Mr. President, let me conclude with this. Yemen stands at another critical juncture. The choices made today will determine the course of its future. A sustainable resolution to this conflict is still possible. I am not naive. This will not be easy. It requires commitment, courage, and action from all sides. The parties must engage in good faith and take the necessary steps to turn commitments into reality. I am aware that they could get a better outcome through the resumption of full-scale military operations. I want to be clear. This would be a mistake for Yemen and a mistake for the stability in the wider region. The responsibility to create the space for a mediated solution does not rest on the Yemeni parties alone. Regional and international stakeholders also share a duty to support diplomacy, de-escalation, and inclusive dialogue. A genuine and lasting peace must be fostered through collective efforts. This requires resolve and coordinated action. I remain fully committed to confronting challenges head-on with a clear, structured, and relentless approach. Thank you very much, Mr. President.
I thank Mr. Grunberg for his briefing. I now give the floor to Mr. Tom Fletcher.
Thank you, Mr. President. I also thank Special Envoy Grunberg for his energetic commitment to peace in Yemen. Mr. President, I hope the Council will join me in grief and outrage at the death this week of our much-loved World Food Programme colleague in detention by the Houthi de facto authorities. Like Special Envoy Grunberg and the Secretary General, my thoughts are with his colleagues and his family. And as I have cause to say here much too often, we must protect our courageous humanitarian workers, wherever they are. Mr. President, the humanitarian appeal for Yemen, which we released last month, paints a grim picture. 19.5 million people need humanitarian support. Millions are hungry and at acute risk of life-threatening illness. Children and women make up more than 3/4 of those in need. According to World Food Programme reporting in December, 64% of the population of Yemen were unable to meet their minimum food needs. And that's up 3 percentage points, even from November. And that number will, I'm afraid, rise again this month, driven by lean season scarcity and rising food prices. Mr. President, as in any crisis, children suffer first and suffer most. 3.2 million children in Yemen are not currently in school. Half of all children under the age of 5 are acutely malnourished. 70% of 3- and 4-year-olds have not received a full course of vaccinations. And children under the age of 5 are dying at a horrific rate, mainly from preventable or treatable conditions. In 2023, an average of 5 every hour. Mr. President, despite significant risks, humanitarian operations across Yemen are largely continuing. But the detention, as described by the Special Envoy, of more UN staff in January has led to tough decisions regarding the ability of the UN system as a whole to deliver for those in need. UN and humanitarian partners simply cannot be expected to operate in the absence of guarantees of their safety. Faced with real risks to the security of our staff, we've therefore been forced to temporarily pause operations in Sa'ada Governorate. We remain fully committed to supporting the millions in need, and we hope that this pause will only be for a short period. And to this end, we're taking all steps to preserve our capacity to restart operations once security guarantees have been obtained. Mr. President, globally, humanitarians are overstretched, underfunded, and under attack. We face this growing challenge in a spirit of cooperation and pragmatism, guided by the urgent needs of those who we serve. The situation in Yemen is perilous. My asks for the Council, 3 asks. First, get United Nations and civil society staff released. They are there on your behalf. Protect them as humanitarian law demands. Because to save lives, humanitarian workers need to talk to anyone, anywhere, at any time. Second, back us to return to UN operations at full capacity. And amid mounting global funding challenges, give us the money to deliver for those we serve. And third, don't take actions which hit the access of civilians to essential services. Political and security decisions should not punish affected communities by limiting the flow of essential commodities into Yemen. Any severe disruptions to that pipeline, commercial or humanitarian, will have cascading negative consequences for Yemeni communities already on the precipice of disaster. These lifelines must remain viable and undisrupted. Mr. President, almost 20 million Yemenis are in need of our support right now. This is a tough place for us to deliver that humanitarian support. And I recognize that it is a tough place for you to get the political judgments right. But we must be brave, principled, and unflinching in our effort to save lives. Thank you.
I thank Mr. Fletcher for his briefing. I now invite the Council members who wish to make statement to take the floor. I give the floor to the United Kingdom.
Thank you, President. I thank Special Envoy Grunberg and USG Fletcher for briefing us today. And I welcome the participation of the Permanent Representative of Yemen in our meeting. I'll make 3 points. First, the UK strongly condemns the tragic death of a World Food Programme staff member while in Houthi detention, and we extend our condolences to their family and colleagues. We also condemn the recent further detentions of aid workers by the Houthis, and we reiterate our clear call for the immediate and unconditional release of all those detained. These detentions are shrinking the humanitarian operating environment at a time when we continue to see an alarming deterioration in the humanitarian situation. We call for an end to the Houthis' use of fear, intimidation, and unjustified detention so that aid workers are able to perform their work supporting almost 20 million Yemenis in need of humanitarian assistance. Second, we welcome the release of the crew of the Galaxy Leader and thank the Sultanate of Oman for their efforts. While we note the pause in maritime attacks, we must see a permanent end to these attacks to restore freedom of navigation in the Red Sea and the Gulf of Aden. As ever, we thank Special Envoy Grunberg for his engagement with the parties and his efforts towards peace and long-term stability in Yemen. Finally, President, the UK reiterates our support to the government of Yemen in delivering governance and providing for its citizens. This was underlined during our event in New York last month with Prime Minister bin Mubarak. The UK stood alongside 23 other member states in calling for international and regional support for the government to strengthen its institutional capacity and help deliver its vision for reform to improve the lives of millions of Yemenis. The UK and the government of Yemen will continue to build on this progress together in the months to come. This is the best way we can support a more secure, stable and prosperous future for all Yemenis. I thank you.
I thank the representative of the United Kingdom for the statement. I give the floor to the representative of Somalia.
Mr. President, I'm honored to deliver this statement on behalf of the A3+, namely Algeria, Guyana, Sierra Leone, and my own country, Somalia. We express our gratitude to Special Envoy Grundberg and USG Fletcher for their briefing, for their valuable updates on the latest developments in Yemen. I also welcome the Permanent Representative of Yemen to this meeting. The A3+ reiterates its unwavering support for UN-led and regional mediation efforts, including those spearheaded by the Kingdom of Saudi Arabia and the Sultanate of Oman, aimed at achieving a Yemeni-owned and a Yemeni-led political resolution to the conflict. A sustainable and inclusive peace process with the meaningful engagement of all stakeholders, including women and youth, remains vital in responding to the aspirations of the Yemeni people. Mr. President, the recent developments in Yemen highlight both progress and challenges. The A3+ welcomes the release of the crew members of the Galaxy Leader who had been held by the Houthis since November of 2023. Their release marked a positive step for the UN staff and other humanitarian personnel in the efforts to build confidence and facilitate broader de-escalation efforts. However, the A3+ is deeply saddened by the tragic loss of a WFP staff member who died while in detention since January 23rd of 2025. We extend our heartfelt condolences to his family and colleagues at WFP and stand in solidarity with all arbitrarily detained UN personnel and their loved ones. The recent detention of additional UN staff is also deeply distressing. The A3+ demands the immediate and unconditional release of all UN, NGOs, civil society organizations, and diplomatic mission staff arbitrarily detained in Yemen, in accordance with international law and relevant international agreements. Furthermore, we insist that the Houthis cease all such illegal activities which undermine peace efforts and contribute to the instability in the country. We urge the parties in Yemen to focus on the following key priorities. First, we are deeply concerned about the continued threats and unlawful arrest and detention of UN personnel by the Houthis, resulting in the suspension of UN humanitarian activities in territories controlled by them. The security and humanitarian situation in Yemen remains fragile, with OCHA reporting that over half of the population need humanitarian assistance and protection services, including in Houthi-controlled Sa'da, which has a population of over 1 million people. While we recognize efforts to improve humanitarian conditions, we emphasize the urgent need for unhindered access to aid across all regions. Second, we reiterate our concerns about the continued attacks on commercial and maritime vessels in the Red Sea. The Houthi attacks in the Red Sea threaten global shipping and undermine regional stability. Such actions not only endanger international trade, but also pose severe risks to the marine ecosystem. We call on the Houthis to permanently cease these hostile activities and urge all parties to exercise restraint to prevent the broader regional crisis. Maritime security must remain a priority, and we support all diplomatic efforts to safeguard the Red Sea as a zone of peace and cooperation. Third, the impact of external military actions. The A3+ is concerned about the increase in external military interventions in Yemen, including Israeli airstrikes and the wider ramification of the Gaza conflict. These actions undermine peace efforts and further destabilize an already fragile situation. We urge all external actors to respect Yemen's sovereignty and refrain from military escalations. We also emphasize the importance of upholding the ceasefire in Gaza, as it will undoubtedly contribute to the de-escalation of the tensions and foster a conducive environment for achieving a lasting and sustainable peace in the broader region. Lastly, addressing food insecurity and economic hardship. The humanitarian crisis in Yemen continues to be exacerbated by food shortages and economic instability, with significant depreciation and rising inflation. According to recent reports, nearly half of the population, approximately 17 million people, will face severe food insecurity in 2025. Urgent and sustained international support is required to address this crisis. Noting that despite tremendous security and logistical challenges, humanitarian organizations were able to support over 8 million Yemenis last year. We call for increased funding for the 2025 Humanitarian Response Plan. We also stress the need for sustainable economic recovery mechanisms to support Yemen's long-term stability. Mr. President, the A3+ firmly believes that a stable and peaceful Yemen is critical for the broader regional security. We continue to advocate for a Yemeni-led and a Yemeni-owned peace process under UN auspices, and we urge all parties to prioritize dialogue over confrontation. In this regard, we reaffirm our support for Special Envoy Grunberg's mediation efforts and encourage all actors to engage constructively in confidence-building measures. Similarly, we emphasize the need for continued international support in addressing Yemen's humanitarian and economic challenges. Overturning the significant economic decline in Yemen after 13 years of conflict requires first and foremost a commitment by all Yemeni actors to peace, as well as support from regional and international partners. In conclusion, Mr. President, the A3+ underscores the critical importance of maintaining momentum toward a comprehensive and inclusive peace process. The people of Yemen have suffered for far too long. Now is time for the international community to redouble its efforts and stand united in pursuit of a peaceful and prosperous future for Yemen. I thank you.
I thank the representative of Somalia for the statement. Now I give the floor to the representative of the United States.
And thank you, Special Envoy Hans Grunberg and Undersecretary General Tom Fletcher, for your briefings that underscored the precarious situation in Yemen and Houthi threats to international peace and security. With material and financial support from Iran, the Houthis have launched numerous attacks on civilian infrastructure, fired at U.S. Navy warships dozens of times since 2023, and attacked commercial vessels indiscriminately. Moreover, they continue to detain UN, diplomatic, and NGO staff, including dozens of current and former U.S. locally employed staff members. The United States condemns the death of a WFP staff member who died while in Houthi detention, and we send our condolences to his family and colleagues. This colleague's death underscores the Iranian and Houthi threat against peace and security and the continuing threat of violence to all Houthi detainees, including United States locally employed staff. Iran's continued and unprecedented provision of weapons components, financial support, and training and technical assistance to the Houthis over more than a decade violates the arms embargo this Council imposed on the group. It is this body's responsibility to respond to Iran's flagrant violations of its resolutions and arming of terrorist groups. Every member of this Council, and especially those with direct channels to Iran, should press Iran's leaders to stop arming, funding, and training the Houthis, without which they would not be able to launch attacks that disrupt navigational rights and freedoms and put innocent civilians in harm's way. Iran must bear the costs of enabling these reckless and egregious attacks. The Houthis' activities threaten the security of American civilians and personnel in the Middle East, the safety of our closest regional partners, and the stability of global maritime trade and local economies. That is why the Trump administration has initiated a process to consider designating the Houthis as a foreign terrorist organization. This is an important step to respond to the threat to civilians and regional stability. It is imperative that the international community works together with regional partners to eliminate the Houthis' capabilities, which continue to threaten international shipping and innocent seafarers. The Houthis must permanently cease all attacks in the Red Sea and surrounding waterways without exception and immediately release all of the hundreds of detainees. We must also deprive the Houthis of illicit revenues that sustain their attacks and disrupt the growing relationship between the Houthis and other terrorist groups like al-Shabaab, including through the use of targeted sanctions. We reiterate our call for this Council to take steps to strengthen the UN verification and inspection mechanism. We call on member states to do their part by increasing funding that supports long-term planning, recruitment of staff, and critical infrastructure that is needed for enhanced capacity. UNVIM is a key means of preventing Iran and other malign actors from smuggling arms and related illicit material to the Houthis. I thank you, Mr. President.
I thank the representative of the United States for the statement. I give the floor to the representative of Pakistan.
Thank you, Mr. President. Mr. President, Pakistan thanks the Special Envoy of the Secretary General for Yemen, Mr. Hans Grunberg, and Undersecretary General for Humanitarian Affairs, Tom Fletcher, for their valuable briefings and updates. We welcome the participation of the Permanent Representative of Yemen in this meeting and reiterate our support to the efforts of the government of Yemen to promote a political solution in his country. The ongoing conflict in Yemen, Mr. President, has emerged as a multi-dimensional crisis, graduating from the local to the regional and ultimately a crisis with global implications. We need to address the various facets of this crisis through effective diplomacy and a collective response. We reaffirm our support for the efforts of the United Nations Special Envoy Grunberg, as well as regional initiatives, particularly by Saudi Arabia and Oman, to facilitate a negotiated political settlement. Pakistan also appreciates the continued engagement of the Special Envoy with regional countries and others involved in the Yemen crisis. Mr. President, while welcoming the release of the crew of Galaxy Leader, we strongly condemn the arbitrary detention of UN personnel and the staff of international and national NGOs and diplomatic missions by Ansarullah, including the most recent additional detentions. We are appalled at the tragic death of a World Food Programme staff member in Houthi custody in Sada and extend our deepest condolences to his family and loved ones. These actions by Ansarullah are a blatant violation of international humanitarian law. Ensuring the safety and security of UN personnel must remain a top priority for the international community. There should be accountability for such actions. We call for the immediate and unconditional release of all detained personnel. Mr. President, the continued suspension of UN operations due to these actions further exacerbate the already dire humanitarian crisis in Yemen. Nearly half of the population, over 17 million people, face acute food insecurity, while climate change-induced disasters, including floods and droughts, have displaced approximately 4.5 million individuals. This crisis necessitates a well-coordinated and robust international response. We urge donor countries to enhance their contributions to the 2025 Humanitarian Response Plan for Yemen, as just appealed by Tom Fletcher, and we call for an adequate response to address the urgent needs of the affected population in Yemen. Mr. President, Pakistan has condemned the Houthi attacks on commercial and merchant vessels. We take note of the Secretary General's report of 7 February 2025, which indicates that no new incidents of attacks on shipping have been recorded in the past month. This development is obviously related to the ceasefire in Gaza. It is imperative, therefore, to ensure that the ceasefire in Gaza continues and all three phases of the ceasefire agreement are implemented for the sake of peace in the occupied Palestinian territories as well as in the broader region, including Yemen. Mr. President, the December 2023 negotiations marked a significant step forward in Yemen. It is imperative to preserve and consolidate the progress which was made and ensure the full implementation of commitments towards lasting peace. We share the Special Envoy's view that the roadmap remains a viable path towards initiated by a nationwide ceasefire, a structural political process, and addressing critical economic and humanitarian challenges facing Yemen. The resumption of military operations would further exacerbate the conflict. Mr. President, in conclusion, Pakistan reiterates its full support for the efforts of the Special Envoy to facilitate a Yemeni-led and Yemeni-owned political process under UN auspices. We stand in solidarity with the people of Yemen in their pursuit for peace, stability, and prosperity. Thank you, Mr. President.
I thank the representative of Pakistan for the statement. Now I give the floor to the representative of the Russian Federation.
Thank you, Mr. President. We thank the Special Envoy of the Secretary General for Yemen, Hans Grundberg, and the Under Secretary General for Humanitarian Affairs and Emergency Relief Coordinator Tom Fletcher for their briefings. We continue following the situation in Yemen very closely, and we saw some positive developments there recently. The situation at the line of contact remains calm despite some local incidents, including in the province of Marib. It is clear that neither one of the Yemeni sides is interested in escalation on the ground. We note the efforts made by the official Yemeni authorities to restore the national economy and improving the living conditions of the people. As had been predicted by many an expert, after there was an agreement on ending hostilities in the Gaza Strip, which came into effect on the 19th of January, there was a noticeable stabilization of the situation in the waters off Yemen. We note positively a statement made in this regard by the Ansar Allah movement about them ending the strikes against commercial ships in the Red Sea, and this is also confirmed in the most recent Secretary General's report. We welcome the fact that on the 22nd of January, with the support of Oman, the Houthis released the crew of the cargo vessel Galaxy Leader, and we do hope that in the very near future, the freedom of navigation in the Red Sea will be fully restored. At the same time, we are concerned by information about the continued detention by Houthis of the local UN staff. At the end of January in Saad, 8 more people were arrested. Under these conditions, the United Nations declared that it was temporarily suspending the operations in that province. We express condolences related to the death of a WFP staff on the 10th of February. Such incidents have no justification, regardless of where they take place in Yemen or any other part of the world. At the same time, the situation as regards the earlier people detained has not been fully resolved either. I would like to recall here that the humanitarians have their privileges and immunities, which must mandatorily be upheld by all parties. We note the continued work that's being done by the United Nations to find out the background of what happened, ensuring the humanitarian access to the detainees and creating the conditions for the eventual release. And this has already given us some results. At the end of last year, the Houthis released 4 people. We, for our part, continue helping the United Nations here as much as we can. Mr. President, taking the general stabilization in Yemen I mentioned and around Yemen, we can say that what is happening is an opportunity to use this positive trend and enhance the comprehensive political efforts to relaunch the political settlement. This would be important inter alia to make sure that we do not lose the outcome of the long work on the roadmap that's been conducted here. We call on all parties to immediately restart the negotiating process. The international mediation is very important here to continue its targeted and inclusive work with Yemeni protagonists, including Ansar Allah, so as to get to sustainable parameters of normalization conflict as quickly as possible. And we stand ready to continue providing whatever help we can to the Special Envoy Grundberg here. And then on the basis of such agreements in the future, what could be launched is an international legal basis for the Yemeni settlement so as to correctly reflect the current military political realities in the country. Under the current conditions, what becomes very important are measures to restore trust, the so-called small steps practice, which can bridge the gap between parties to the conflict. And we welcome, therefore, here the release by Houthis done unilaterally of 153 prisoners of war at the end of January, which was done through the International Committee of Red Cross and Red Crescent. Mr. President, wide international cooperation is also needed to rectify the humanitarian situation in Yemen. The number of people who need such assistance last year reached 19.5 million, which is 1.5 million than last year. More than half of these households throughout the country are experiencing food shortages. Child mortality is going up, including from very treatable diseases, and the reason for that is a shortage of medications and lack of access to qualified health care. There is also a serious shortage of targeted funding for humanitarian programs, including the Humanitarian Response Plan for Yemen. In 2025, we'll need $2.5 billion. So as to rectify this situation, what is needed is not just larger humanitarian funding, but also remove the obstacles which are impeding humanitarian supplies to the needy throughout the Yemen. Against this background, to be perfectly frank, what came out like a lightning out of the blue was information about launching a process to include the Houthis in the U.S. list of foreign terrorist organizations. This step can not only seriously impede the work of humanitarians in Yemen, but also have a negative impact on further mediation efforts to relaunch the political process. The decision by Washington to increase pressure on Ansar Allah and creating, therefore, additional motives for escalation looks completely divorced from reality. The ill-considered steps taken by the previous administration of the White House resulted in a more than a year delay in the confrontation of the Houthis and the worsening of the suffering of the Yemeni people. Now, when the situation seemingly began to de-escalate, the U.S. is undertaking steps which will lead to its escalating. To be perfectly honest, a conclusion begs itself that the United States is not interested in the Yemeni settlement with the Houthi participation, who are an integral part of the Yemeni society. I'd like to believe that this initiative is undertaken by the new administration in a rush without proper analysis and will be revised. Otherwise, the blame for undermining efforts to establish a long-hoped-for peace in Yemen will be laid at Washington's door. I thank you.
I thank the representative of the Russian Federation. I now give the floor to the representative of Greece.
President, let me start by thanking Special Envoy Hans Grundberg and Under Secretary General Tom Fletcher for the informative briefings and the tireless efforts to promote peace and stability in Yemen. I would also like to welcome the presence here today of the Permanent Representative of Yemen. Mr. President, despite the relatively decline in Houthis attacks over the past month, the situation in Yemen in the region of the Red Sea remains critical and volatile. The grave humanitarian situation and political crisis remain jeopardized with increasingly negative consequences for the Yemeni people and the broader region. Allow me to make the following brief points. First, although we welcome the release of the Galaxy Leader crew as a positive step, we condemn in the strongest terms the recently arbitrary detentions by the Houthis of additional UN personnel in continuation of the deplorable trend of arbitrary detentions initiated by the group back in June. We deeply deplore that one recently detained member of the UN World Food Programme personnel lost his life while he was arbitrarily detained, and we express our sincere condolences to his family and the UN. The circumstances of his death must be thoroughly investigated. We call for the immediate and unconditional release of all diplomatic staff, UN and NGO personnel, and humanitarian workers who continue to be arbitrarily detained by the Houthis, and encourage this Council to relay a strong message in this respect. Secondly, all parties in the conflict must fully respect the obligations under international humanitarian law to authorize and facilitate the rapid, safe and unimpeded delivery of humanitarian aid. The safety and security of humanitarian workers must be protected in order to be able to deliver life-saving supplies, especially food and medicine. We also remain dedicated to the UN verification and inspection mechanism for Yemen, which has undertaken a colossal task of clearing much-needed shipment of goods and foodstuffs to address the population needs. Thirdly, the instability in the region of the Red Sea continues to raise deep concern. Unpredictability prevails as the peril of resurgence of Houthi aggressions against merchant ships is endangering the safety of a crucial global maritime trading route and a significant pathway for the provision of humanitarian assistance in this war-torn region. Greece is strongly committed to safeguarding freedom of navigation and maritime security in the region of the Red Sea. We continue to play a leading role in the European Union's naval operation Aspides, in full compliance with international law, and with respect to the defensive posture of the operation, working closely with the international community in protecting one of the world's most important maritime routes. Mr. President, the Council and the countries of the region must send a clear message of unity and commitment to the need for military de-escalation between the opposing sides of the Yemeni conflict, and especially the Houthis. In addition, this Council and the international community should exert their influence on all sides for the resumption of the peace process under UN auspices as the only viable path for stability and security in Yemen and the Red Sea region. This process must contain all the necessary guardrails and address the security concerns of neighboring states and major stakeholders. My country, Greece, reiterates its full support to the SRSG Hans Grundberg and his continuous and dedicated efforts to revitalize the peace dialogue in Yemen through an inclusive Yemeni-led and Yemeni-owned political process under the UN auspices. The substantial and equal participation of women in this process must also be guaranteed. Only through consistent mediation efforts and collective political engagement by all relevant stakeholders can a sustainable and lasting solution be achieved for Yemen. I thank you.
I thank the representative of Greece. I now give the floor to the representative of Slovenia.
Thank you, Mr. President. I thank Special Envoy Grunberg and Under Secretary General Fletcher for their briefings. You can rest assured of Slovenia's full support for your efforts. I also welcome Yemeni permanent representative to the meeting. Mr. President, it is with deep regret that we are convening today against the backdrop of the devastating news of the death of the World Food Programme staff member in Houthi detention earlier this week. We offer our condolences to his family and call for a swift, transparent and thorough investigation into his death. This follows the detention of an additional 8 UN personnel at the end of January, bringing the total number of UN staff now detained by the Houthis to 23. Slovenia believes that this warrants this Council's outright condemnation. We call once again for the immediate and unconditional release of all UN staff, as well as all others detained by the Houthis. Resolution 2730 on the protection of humanitarian and UN personnel is clear on the parties' obligation and responsibilities. Humanitarians must never be a target. Mr. President, these actions are particularly reprehensible when humanitarian needs are so high. It is not only an attack on humanitarians and on the UN family, but also an attack on all those Yemenis who need humanitarian assistance the most. The recently published 2025 Humanitarian Response Plan for Yemen shows that needs are growing. Food insecurity, malnutrition, and lack of clean water remains a serious concern across many parts of the country. The specter of famine is never far from the Yemeni people. Since joining the Council, we have underlined the need for all stakeholders to prioritize the protection and needs of civilians in Yemen first and foremost. We continue to make this plea. We believe that any worsening of this humanitarian crisis will only take us further away from peace, our shared goal. Mr. President, we hope that the ceasefire agreement in Gaza, as well as between Israel and Lebanon, would offer a precious opportunity to bring much-needed peace and stability to the entire region, including in Yemen. We must strive towards a sustainable, nationwide ceasefire in Yemen and making progress of an inclusive intra-Yemeni political process that prioritizes the population's needs and lays the groundwork for reconciliation and recovery, building on the truce first secured by the Special Envoy in 2022. A political process in which women will fully, meaningfully and safely participate. The recent release of the Galaxy Leader crew was welcome, and we recognize the important role played by the Sultanate of Oman in achieving this outcome. In conclusion, we urge all parties, particularly the Houthis, to refrain from any escalatory or inflammatory acts and rhetoric during this critical period. All attacks must end and all detentions must be reversed. Last month, I called on all sides to seize the moment and show a genuine commitment to peace and good governance. I reiterate this call, which today feels all the more urgent. I thank you.
I thank the representative of Slovenia. I give the floor to the representative of Denmark.
Thank you, Mr. President. I would like to thank Special Envoy Grunberg and Under Secretary General Fletcher for their briefings. I also welcome the representative of Yemen to our meeting today. Colleagues, recent development across the Middle East have given cause for cautious optimism. Across the region, a reduction in violence has led to real dividends of peace for millions of people. It is therefore deeply distressing that, despite these trends, the situation in Yemen continues to grow more dire. This year alone, a staggering 19.5 million people will need humanitarian assistance and protection services. Food insecurity is soaring. Half of all children under 5 are acutely malnourished. As always, the most vulnerable are the most affected. Around this table and across the international community, we have a responsibility to act. We must find ways to meet the needs of the population in line with humanitarian principles. Denmark is stepping up. We recently provided a new contribution of $13.5 million to the humanitarian response in Yemen, contributing to the life-saving efforts of the ICRC, the World Food Programme, and the Yemen Humanitarian Fund. We urge others to join us. Mr. President, as we speak, personnel from the UN, NGOs, civil society, and diplomatic missions are being held in captivity by the Houthis, deprived of their freedom. Arbitrarily detained, many of them working to provide life-saving humanitarian assistance to civilian Yemenis in need. These arbitrary detention by Houthis have forced UN to pause all humanitarian operations in the governorate of Sada. We continue to call for unhindered and sustained access for humanitarian operations across Yemen, of which the safety and security of humanitarian personnel is a prerequisite. Earlier this week, we received the tragic news that an aid worker from the World Food Programme died while being held captive by the Houthis. We are deeply concerned by this and extend our condolences to his family and to the UN community. Let there be no doubt, the safety and security of the UN and other humanitarian personnel must always be guaranteed. Humanitarian aid and the personnel providing it must not be held hostage in political power games. Disinformation about and against them must stop. We demand their immediate and unconditional release. In addition, it's important that all restrictive measures, both UN sanctions and sanctions outside the scope of the UN, against the Houthis do not lead to unintended humanitarian consequences for the civilian population. Such consequences could present challenges to the humanitarian and the commercial sector in Yemen. With Yemen importing nearly 80% of all food, fuels, textiles, and medicines, we must do all we can to mitigate such effects. Mr. President, Denmark has positively noted the Houthis' announcement to halt their attacks on commercial shipping in light of the ceasefire in Gaza, but underlines that this must also be the case for Israeli-flagged and operated vessels. The attacks on civilian commercial vessels must be halted entirely. We welcome the Houthis' release of 153 conflict-related detainees. This represents a confidence-building measure and hopefully a first step in a series of many. Such actions should provide new momentum towards a resumption of the peace process led by Special Envoy Grunberg and towards the implementation of the UN Roadmap for Peace. These important processes deserve our full support. In this regard, we underline that in order for peace to be sustainable, it must be inclusive. That means ensuring the full, equal, meaningful, and safe participation of a diverse group of women in the political process. It means supporting the participation of young people and civil society of all political backgrounds from all regions of Yemen. Only a political solution to the conflict can bring peace to Yemen. We urge all stakeholders to exercise restraint and refrain from escalatory rhetoric that could derail these efforts. Mr. President, in conclusion, we call on all parties to demonstrate their genuine interest in peace, to recommit to the UN-led process, to put it simply, to prioritize the needs of the Yemeni people. Thank you.
I thank the representative of Denmark and now give the floor to the representative of France.
Merci, Monsieur le Président.
Thank you, Mr. President. I would like to thank the Special Envoy, Mr. Hans Grunberg, and I also thank the Undersecretary General for Humanitarian Affairs, Mr. Fletcher, for their briefings. I welcome also the presence of the permanent representative of Yemen at this meeting of ours. Mr. President, France is deeply outraged by the death of Ahmed, a WFP staff who had been arbitrarily detained by the Houthis in inhumane conditions on 23rd of January. We convey our condolences to his family and colleagues. His death is a new illustration of a systematic violation of the IHL committed by the Houthis. France calls upon this Council to speak with one voice so as to condemn this crime. France reiterates also his strongest possible condemnation of the arbitrary detention by the Houthis of dozens of UN and humanitarian staffs, both local and internationally, but also the representatives of the Yemeni civil society. We demand their immediate and unconditional release. We urge the Houthis to guarantee a safe and unimpeded humanitarian access and to put an end to any and all threat and any and all disinformation campaign against humanitarians. We heard that the actions by the Houthis do not leave with the UN with any choice other than suspending its activities in the Sada governorate to protect its staff. Through their actions, the Houthi undermine the assistance to the Yemeni people, which is very much needed, and also further worsen the humanitarian crisis in the country. France welcomes the unfailing commitment of the UN and humanitarian staff who remain on the ground and remain ready to resume their activities whenever the security conditions for that are there, and we should support them. Mr. President, because of their actions and their provocative statements, the Houthis have the prime responsibility for the ongoing regional crisis. Their actions show yet once again how indifferent they are to the suffering of the Yemeni people. But let us not give in to this plan of theirs. The international community has a responsibility to support the relaunching of the inter-Yemeni peace process and to create the conditions which are needed for the UN mediation resumption. We reiterate, therefore, our full support to the Special Envoy, Mr. Hans Grundberg, in his efforts to prepare the resumption of the peace process. We also welcome the constructive efforts undertaken by Saudi Arabia and the Sultanate of Oman to facilitate these discussions. The unity of the Yemeni Presidential Council is also essential, as is the strengthening of the Yemeni government. On their side, the Houthis have to return to the negotiating table led by the Special Envoy. France underscores the importance of inclusive negotiations, guaranteeing the participation of the entirety of the civil society, and in particular the Yemeni women. We reaffirm our commitment to the stability of Yemen and regional security. France recalls the need to avoid any new escalation in the region and call upon Iran to cease its support to destabilizing actions in the Middle East. We will continue our commitment within the defensive operation Hostilities within the European Union policy of security and defense so as to protect maritime safety and freedom of navigation, and will do it in line with international law and together with our partners. I thank you.
I thank France. I now give the floor to the representative of Panama.
Thank you, Mr. President. Panama is grateful to the President of this Council for convening this meeting. We thank the Special Envoy of the Secretary General for Yemen, Hans Grundberg, and the Undersecretary General for Humanitarian Affairs and Emergency Relief Coordinator, Mr. Tom Fletcher, for their valuable contributions. We also recognize the participation of the distinguished representative of Yemen at this meeting. We deeply regret the tragic loss of a staff member of the UN World Food Programme on the 10th of February. He died while he was being held arbitrarily by the Houthis. To date, the circumstances and causes of his death remain unknown. That must be clarified, we hope, through an exhaustive investigation. We extend our most sincere condolences to his family and to the entire UN team. We firmly condemn the illegal detention of the 17 local UN staff who should be released. All of them should have been released a long time ago, but they should be released immediately. And we also condemn the more recent arbitrary detention of another 7 staff on the 23rd of January. And as we have said, this has led to the tragic death of one of them while they were being held by the Houthis. These acts are a flagrant violation of international law, and they represent a direct attack on humanitarian work. This is absolutely unacceptable. We most emphatically call for the immediate and unconditional release of all the detainees. The humanitarian situation in Yemen has worsened significantly due to economic decline, climate shocks, and regional escalations. These factors have led to the need for humanitarian assistance and have aggravated the risks of providing protection. In 2025, it is estimated that 19.5 million people in Yemen require humanitarian assistance and protection services. This is an increase of 1.3 million people over last year. Almost half the population is facing acute food insecurity. More than 13 million people lack sufficient access to drinking water, and 40% of the healthcare centers are either operating partially or are not in use at all. In this context, we must ensure that humanitarian aid reaches those most in need unhindered. We must always bear the well-being of the Yemeni people in mind. That should be a priority. Aware of our global responsibility and with our firm political determination, Panama has made efforts to contribute to humanitarian assistance through the UN Office for the Coordination of Humanitarian Affairs by providing making a contribution within our ability to the Humanitarian Fund for Yemen. We reiterate our support for the efforts of the Office of the Special Envoy, working tirelessly with all relevant actors to achieve and maintain a ceasefire. That will be a positive step towards a sustained and lasting peace process. With that said, we welcome the meetings held by the UN Office of the Special Envoy in Yemen with women Yemeni entrepreneurs, underscoring their key role in economic recovery and stability in the country. Mr. President, the Republic of Panama welcomes the release of the 25 crew members of the Galaxy Leader vessel who come from Bulgaria, Mexico, Philippines, Romania, and Ukraine. They have been detained illegally by the Houthis for more than a year. This act should serve as an example to follow and an example of the urgent need to put an end to arbitrary detentions and kidnappings and to bring an end to the suffering of UN personnel who are still detained. Moreover, I would underscore the urgency of restoring maritime safety in the region. This is essential to guarantee the stability of trade routes and to provide humanitarian assistance. On a positive note, according to the latest SG report, the International Maritime Organization points out that there have not been any new incidents against vessels since the previous report. We hope that this means progress towards restoring security and stability in the maritime area. We firmly condemn any declarations expressing a possible continuation of unjustified attacks by the Houthis in the Red Sea against vessels with links to Israel. The situation in Yemen is fragile, as are the possibilities for peace, and we acknowledge the fragile nature of the situation in Gaza and in the remainder of the region as we consider all facets of the peace agreement. Mr. President, we believe that this Council must firmly defend maritime safety and rights of navigation, calling for a permanent end to all attacks in the Red Sea and attacks in surrounding maritime corridors. Necessary action must be taken to protect the safety of UN staff and condemn any act which puts their integrity at danger. Thank you.
I thank Panama for the statement. I give the floor to the Republic of Korea.
Thank you, Mr. President. My gratitude goes to Special Envoy Hans Grundberg and OCHA USG Tom Fletcher for their informative updates. I also welcome the participation of the representative of Yemen at the Council today. Mr. President, today, as the Middle East stands at a perilous crossroad, Yemen remains mired in a fragile balance between conflict and stability. The choices made in the coming weeks and months will determine whether the country moves toward lasting peace and stability or slides back into deepening crisis. In this light, I'd like to underscore the following points today. First, the Republic of Korea condemns in the strongest terms the Houthis' illegal detention of 8 additional UN staff members. We demand the immediate and unconditional release of all arbitrarily detained UN, NGOs, civil society, and diplomatic personnel. We are acutely saddened and outraged by the tragic death of a WFP staffer, a father of 2, on February 10th, who had been unlawfully detained by the Houthis since January. This heartbreaking loss underscores the grave risks humanitarian workers face in Houthi-controlled areas, where the delivery of critical humanitarian assistance to Yemeni people in desperate need is severely obstructed. The Houthis must abide by international humanitarian law. The safety of humanitarian workers and their access to civilians must be guaranteed, as emphasized by Security Council Resolution 2730. Second, we are deeply concerned by ongoing violations and abuses of human rights in Yemen, particularly by the Houthis against the Yemeni people, as documented in the Panel of Experts report. The Houthis, while seeking humanitarian aid from the outside world, have shown hostility toward the international community's engagement on human rights, better governance, and peace building. This is unacceptable. It is also deplorable that the Houthis are consolidating control over civilians by instilling fear, silencing the voices of civil society, and isolating them from the international community. We urge the Houthis to cease human rights abuses in their controlled area and focus on enhancing the safety and the well-being of the residents. We also call on the Houthis to stop undermining the long-stalled Yemeni-led political transition process, which requires inclusive participation by all, including women and youth. Third, all stakeholders must prioritize creating new opportunities for peace and stability amid the rapidly shifting dynamics in the Middle East. All relevant political actors, including the Houthis and the neighboring countries, must refocus their attention on de-escalation and engage in dialogue and negotiations to restart the Yemeni-led political process under UN auspices, which has been stalled since October 7. In this regard, we note and encourage the Special Envoy's tireless efforts to lay the groundwork for tangible progress in the political process by actively engaging with the key players in the region, including Saudi Arabia and Oman. In this context, it is crucial that the ceasefire hostage deal in Gaza must be implemented and extended into the next phase. We cannot tolerate any actions that turn back the clock to the catastrophe before the January 19th agreement, which also have the potential to rekindle insecurity and violence in Yemen and the Red Sea. Fourth, we reiterate the importance of full and faithful implementation of relevant Security Council resolutions, particularly the arms embargo. Indeed, the unprecedented transfers of diverse military material and technology to the Houthis, as highlighted by the Panel of Experts report last October, have sounded the alarm. In light of this troubling reality, we stress the crucial role of UNVIM, the UN verification and inspection mechanism, in ensuring compliance with the arms embargo. The international community should also place greater emphasis on strengthening the Yemeni government's capacity to effectively enforce the arms embargo. In addition, as the chair of the Yemen Sanctions Committee last year and likely this year, I look forward to the swift appointment of new panel experts for the Sanctions Committee. The Republic of Korea remains firmly committed to ensuring a brighter future of Yemen and its people. I thank you, Mr. President.
I thank the representative of the Republic of Korea for his statement. I shall now make a statement in my capacity as the representative of China. I thank Special Envoy Grunberg and Under Secretary General Fletcher for their briefings. I also warmly welcome the presence of the representative of Yemen at today's meeting. Following the recent ceasefire in Gaza, tensions in Yemen and the Red Sea largely abated. However, given the complex dynamics of the conflict and the palpable lack of willingness for political settlement, the situation on the ground remains fragile. China maintains that no matter how the situation evolves, the Yemeni issue should be resolved politically, and that Yemen's sovereignty, security, and territorial integrity should be respected, international humanitarian law be observed, and civilians be protected. I will make 4 points. First of all, facts over the past year have proven that there is no military solution to this conflict, and violence will only lead to dire consequences. A cessation of hostilities is a sine qua non for de-escalation. All parties concerned should seize the ceasefire in Gaza as an opportunity, stop assaulting commercial vessels, cease airstrikes on Yemen, and avoid another flare-up of the situation. All parties to the conflict in Yemen should utilize the Redeployment Coordination Committee, enhance military coordination, and avoid miscalculation. Secondly, it is the hope of the international community that the UN support will help break the political deadlock and relaunch the peace process. All parties in Yemen should put the interests of their people first, respond to the call of the international community, and resume dialogue and communication as soon as possible. Countries in the region should play a positive role and constructively facilitate dialogue among the parties. China supports Special Envoy Grunberg in redoubling his mediation efforts. Thirdly, all parties in Yemen should actively cooperate with the humanitarian relief efforts of the UN to ensure unimpeded humanitarian access, as well as the safety and security of humanitarian workers. The international community should sustain its humanitarian aid in Yemen and support the country's economic development and livelihood improvement. Recently, several additional UN personnel were detained in Yemen, and a World Food Programme staff member died while in detention. China is appalled by this incident and expresses serious concern over those incidents. China calls on the Houthis to immediately and unconditionally release all detained persons and guarantee their living conditions. Fourthly, we cannot discuss Yemen and the Red Sea in isolation from the regional context. As we speak, the implementation of the ceasefire agreement in Gaza faces uncertainty. At this critical juncture, the international community, especially the major powers, should play a constructive role. The recent proposal of the U.S. to clean out and take over Gaza has caused an uproar and was met with strong opposition from the Arab world and the wider international community. China always maintains that Gaza belongs to the Palestinian people and is an integral part of the Palestinian territory. China firmly supports the legitimate rights of the Palestinian people as a nation. We're consistently of the view that Palestinians governing Palestine is an important principle that must be upheld in the governance of Gaza and oppose the forced relocation of Gazans. We stand ever ready to work with the international community to stay the course of the two-state solution as the fundamental way forward and make positive efforts toward peaceful coexistence between Palestine and Israel and long-term peace and stability in the Middle East. I now resume my function as President of the Council. I give the floor to the representative of Yemen.
Thank Thank you, Mr. President. Allow me at the outset to congratulate you on presiding over the Security Council this month, wishing you all the success in your endeavor. We also thank your predecessor, the permanent representative of Algeria, for successfully conducting the work of the Council last month. I thank Mr. Grandberg and Mr. Tom Fletcher for their briefings. We express our deepest sympathies and condolences to the family of the Yemeni citizen Ahmed Ba'alawi, the World Food Programme staff in Yemen, who died in the prisons of terrorist Houthi militias following his kidnapping and forced disappearance with 7 other UN staff on January 23, 2025. We also express our condolences to the World Food Programme, the United Nations, and the humanitarian community in general. Terrorist Houthi militias continue their practices and criminal policies against the staff of international organizations and UN agencies operating in areas under their control and civil society organizations. This reflects the systemic criminal behavior by these militias and their grave violations of international humanitarian law and the international human rights law, as well as to the international norms and instruments and national legislations. These militias continue to restrict and obstruct the work of relief and humanitarian workers. They have launched a campaign of kidnappings last June against dozens of staff of United Nations, international organizations, local organizations, and CSOs. Recently, in the last month, they kidnapped 8 other UN staff in a blatant violation of the rules of humanitarian work and the will of the international community. In a continuation of their violations and crimes against Yemenis. The killing of our citizen Ba'alawi sounds the alarm about the gravity of the situation of the kidnapped and detainees in the prisons of such militias. It is not unlikely that they face the same fate, especially as the terrorist Houthi militias' practices are not prevented. The Yemeni government has warned time and again against this. We reaffirm the need for the international community, the United Nations, and the August Council to take urgent action to save and protect the life of humanitarian workers and take firm measures to stop Houthi violations, to ensure the immediate and unconditional release of the kidnapped and detainees. We stress the call of the Secretary General to conduct a comprehensive, transparent, and immediate investigation into this incident and hold the perpetrators accountable. In this vein, the Yemeni government calls once again for the transfer of the headquarters of international organizations and UN agencies operating in Yemen to the temporary capital, Aden, to ensure a safe and stable environment for humanitarian workers and facilitate the delivery of humanitarian assistance without any discrimination or hindrance to all the society. Mr. President, the Yemeni people today is suffering from the repercussions of a tremendous, unprecedented, and immeasurable economic and humanitarian crisis. It has gone on for so long because of the war launched by the terrorist Houthi militias supported by the Iranian regime against the Yemeni people longing for peace, because of the destructive approach adopted by these militias and their rejection of the efforts to achieve peace and their insistence to prolong the conflict and the vicious cycle of violence. They fully disregard the humanitarian suffering of Yemenis. They destroy the values of coexistence and dialogue. The Presidential Leadership Council and the Yemeni government have stressed time and again that they are attached to a just and comprehensive peace based on the terms of reference of the agreed political solution, mainly Security Council Resolution 2216. They stress that they are open to all international and regional efforts to address the Yemeni crisis and alleviate the suffering of the Yemeni people. people to achieve their aspirations to security, stability, and development, to provide all support to the Special Envoy of the Secretary General, Mr. Hans Grundberg. The Yemeni government has committed to the April 2022 truce because it wants to protect the interests of the Yemeni people and their resources. It wants to address the humanitarian and economic situation and provide a conducive environment for the political process, despite the military escalation by Houthi militias in a number of governorates, latest of which was the military escalation and mobilization in Ma'rib, Al-Jof, Ta'iz, and their violations of all their commitments, as well as their plans to return to a full-scale war to drown Yemen in a larger humanitarian crisis. The Presidential Leadership Council and the Yemeni government have stressed that peace remains the obvious strategic option. The window to peace cannot be shut when there is a genuine, serious, and responsible partner, when there is full awareness of the need of all Yemenis to participate in building their future. We cannot accept an armed group fighting with the state over its only power, claiming a divine right to rule Yemenis. Efforts to achieve a just and comprehensive peace to end this conflict and address the Yemeni crisis cannot succeed until the Houthi militias stop their extortion of the international and regional community. This cannot happen until pressure is put on these militias to engage in a positive and serious way with good intention to put the interest of the Yemeni people first and to dry up their financing and arming resources. We stress that the best and most guaranteed way for peace in Yemen is by supporting the Yemeni government and promoting its security and economic capacity so that it can practice its control over all Yemen. Recovery in Yemen is not only a national interest. It is good for regional and international peace and security. It is good for protecting international maritime corridors in the Red Sea and Bab el-Mandeb Strait and the Aden Gulf. All Security Council resolutions on the crisis in Yemen must be implemented, especially Resolution 2216. The international community and this august council need to shoulder their responsibility. They need to take effective and firm action and positions to push Houthi militias towards peace, to end this war, which has claimed the lives of more than 500,000 Yemenis. It has displaced hundreds of thousands of Yemenis to other continents and countries. It pushed more than 20 million Yemenis to poverty, hunger, and food insecurity. It pushed more than 4 million Yemenis to internal displacement camps where with difficult humanitarian circumstances and no dignified livelihood. Mr. President, this conflict has had destructive humanitarian and economic impacts on Yemen. It has created one of the worst humanitarian crises in the world. Despite these tremendous challenges, the Yemeni government is making tremendous efforts to restore state institutions and implement a number of financial, economic, and administrative reforms to implement its commitments and alleviate the daily suffering of its citizens, to curb the repercussions of terrorist Houthi militias' attacks on oil facilities, and to prevent the repercussions of oil exports on the humanitarian and economic situation in Yemen. We know that ending the humanitarian suffering in Yemen can only be achieved by ending the crisis. We cannot wait for peace to start development in Yemen. In the high-level ministerial meeting held at the United Nations last January between the Yemeni government and the United Kingdom, we presented our plan for economic recovery and its implementation table. We addressed the main priorities to promote the role of institutions, the capacities of the government to provide better basic services and address the changes in the national exchange rate, basic goods, and protect the most vulnerable, as well as to ensure better access by the state to its sovereign resources. We also discussed partnership with the international community to provide a mechanism to promote such partnerships. We call upon the international community to provide political, financial, and economic support to Yemen to achieve its recovery vision and economic stability. This is essential for our efforts to succeed. In this vein, we highly appreciate the fraternal support provided by our brothers in the Kingdom of Saudi Arabia to the Yemeni people and its government in different fields to alleviate their humanitarian suffering. Mr. President, the United States' decision to list the Houthi militias as a foreign terrorist group was welcomed by the Yemeni government. This is an important step to understand and acknowledge the nature of the threat and risk posed by this group, supported by the Iranian regime, on international and regional peace and security, and on the Yemeni people, as well as its role in destabilizing Yemen and the region and attacking its security. We call upon the international community to follow suit, to promote international efforts to fight terrorism and dry up its sources, to fight this reckless behavior by these militias, which not only disregards the interests of the Yemeni people, but also peace and security in the world. Not standing up to those rejecting peace will lead to further terrorism and will impede regional and international peace and security. It will thwart every effort to end this conflict. We hope that this listing becomes a major factor to promote international efforts to achieve peace, achieve stability, and end humanitarian suffering. We stress that we are committed to working with the international community and all humanitarian partners, as well as the national commercial sector, to provide all the necessary facilities and guarantees to ensure the delivery of humanitarian assistance and aid without any hindrance, including to areas under the control of Houthi militias. In conclusion, Mr. President, despite all challenges and difficulties, hope remains in the ability of the Yemeni people to overcome this crisis, to unify national efforts, to end the coup, recover state institutions, and turn a new page of stability, construction, and development, to build a bright future for all Yemenis based on justice, equality, dignity, and the respect to human rights. Thank you, Mr. President.
I thank the representative of Yemen for the statement. There are no more names inscribed on the list of speakers. I now invite council members to informal consultations to continue our discussion on the subject. The meeting is adjourned.